Hey everyone, welcome to this explainer. Today we're going to dismantle a really popular illusion. When we think about the end of World War II, the cultural memory that immediately pops into our heads is usually this unified, global moment of pure, unadulterated joy. But as you've probably guessed, history is rarely that simple. In this explainer, we're diving into the historical sources to reveal how the end of the Second World War was actually this deeply complex web of jubilation, trauma, geopolitical division, and, believe it or not, ongoing conflict. We've all seen the famous photos, right? Like that absolutely iconic image of a sailor randomly kissing a nurse in New York's Times Square. That single snapshot has completely fascinated the world and kind of defined our popular perception of victory. But looking at the broader scope of our sources, we really have to ask ourselves a critical question. What does victory actually look like? How could a single day, or even a single declaration, mean so many vastly different things to a fractured, devastated world? Let's find out. Section 1. The end in Europe. So the really crucial point to grasp here is that the official surrender wasn't some single, synchronized global announcement. It was actually a pretty staggered affair. The initial general surrender was signed by German Field Marshal Alfred Jodl at Allied headquarters in Reims, France, on May 7th. That document called for hostilities to officially cease on May 8th at exactly 23:01 hours. Now, the Western Allies, think leaders like U.S. President Harry S. Truman and U.K. Prime Minister Winston Churchill, they made their official announcements right then, on May 8th. But the Soviet Union, they actually objected to being left out of that initial signing process. They demanded a more all-embracing surrender in Berlin, which didn't become effective until May 9th. So, literally right from the start, the very date of victory was split in two. Just listen to the sheer definitive finality of the language used in the act of military surrender. We, the undersigned, hereby surrender unconditionally. This exact text didn't just sit in some dusty military archive. It rippled out across the entire globe. It was even printed in local community newsletters decades later, like the Sandstone Bush Telegraph over in Western Australia. It brought absolute legal finality to the Nazi regime, strictly commanding that no ship be scuttled and absolutely no damage be done to equipment. Moving on to Section 2, Jubilation and Deadly Chaos. Now, the initial thesis of victory across the Allied nations was undeniably just unbridled joy. Look at these staggering figures. We're talking over 1 million people massed on the streets in the UK, with massive crowds gathering right at the gates of Buckingham Palace. Famously, Princesses Elizabeth and Margaret were actually allowed to wander incognito among the crowds to join in on the celebrations, which is just wild to think about. Meanwhile, down in Sydney, Australia, an estimated 15,000 people partied in King's Cross. The celebrations were so ecstatic that office workers literally threw shredded paper out of their windows for over an hour. One guy in Sydney even jokingly said he hoped the paper raining down was his personal tax file, sacrificed for the nation's greater joy. But this incredible joy was sharply offset by the hidden shadows of victory. While people were literally forming conga lines in Washington, D.C., other cities descended into deadly, destructive chaos. In Halifax, Nova Scotia, massive VE Day riots exploded when mobs of intoxicated servicemen and civilians completely ransacked stores and vandalized almost the entire business district, which tragically resulted in 3 deaths. And later, during the VJ Day celebrations, San Francisco experienced the worst rioting in its entire history, leaving 11 people dead. It's a really dark side of the revelry that, honestly, has largely been forgotten today. Section 3. The Survivor's Reality. For Kindertransport refugees, these were children who had been sent to safety in the UK years earlier. The end of the war meant an agonizing resumption of communication. Martha Blend, who arrived in England as just a 9-year-old girl, recalled dreading what she might discover. And tragically, the end of the conflict brought her only the devastating confirmation that her entire family had been murdered in the Holocaust. For refugees like Martha, VE Day wasn't a story of jubilation at all. It was one of immense, profound grief. To truly wrap our heads around the scale of the tragedy on Liberation Day, consider this single, absolutely staggering number: 93. Out of the 15,000 children who were deported to the Theresienstadt ghetto camp, survivor Stephen Frank and his brothers were among only 93 children who actually survived. Think about that. When Liberation Day finally arrived on May 8th, Stephen recalled that while people in the UK were literally dancing in the streets, prisoners in his camp were starving to death, completely desensitized to the dying happening all around them. For them, any hope of normality was just gone. The reality is, the suffering didn't just magically stop because a piece of paper was signed. Take the Bergen-Belsen concentration camp, for example. It was liberated by British troops just 3 weeks prior to VE Day. But because of extreme malnutrition and the rapid, terrifying spread of diseases like typhus, the struggle to survive was very much ongoing. In the weeks and months after liberation, a further 13,000 people died in that camp alone. For these survivors and even for their liberators, VE Day was this profoundly subdued, agonizing continuation of suffering. Section 4. The war continues. In places like Australia, even right in the middle of the celebrations, there was this very tangible air of subdued reflection. Why? Because the deadly Pacific conflict was far from over. There were still thousands of prisoners of war desperately awaiting release, and large numbers of servicemen were still on active duty fighting a really brutal war against Japan. And perhaps most terrifyingly, the Allies were actively planning Operation Downfall. This was a massive invasion of the Japanese home islands projected to end the war in the fall of 1946, and it came with an estimated unimaginable cost of 1 million Allied casualties. So the shadow of Operation Downfall loomed incredibly heavily over everything until the atomic devastation of Hiroshima on August 6th and Nagasaki on August 9th forced a sudden conclusion. Japan announced its surrender on August 14th, which of course sparked another massive wave of global celebrations known as VJ Day. However, President Truman actually intentionally delayed the formal proclamation of victory until the physical surrender ceremony took place aboard the battleship USS Missouri on September 2, 1945. It was only then that the global conflict was truly, officially silenced. Section 5. Global Traditions of Remembrance. Today, this complex web of history literally dictates our modern calendar. In the UK, May 8th is observed with street festivities. In Russia, because of that delayed Berlin signing we discussed earlier, May 9th is the day, and it's marked with massive military parades in Red Square. France celebrates on May 8th, but the city of Orleans uniquely combines it with the anniversary of Joan of Arc, lifting the city's siege way back in 1429. Meanwhile, the Baltic states, Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, they specifically choose to commemorate May 8th to deliberately distance themselves from the May 9th Soviet Victory Day, which they associate with the beginning of Soviet occupation. It's just a really striking reminder of how the exact same historical event is processed entirely differently depending on where you stand in the world. But at a local level, the grand chaos of global geopolitics often softens into much quieter, more reflective traditions. In communities like the Shire of Sandstone in Western Australia, the focus turns to days like Anzac Day, which is powerfully marked by the iconic red poppy. It's a moment to just pause, stepping away from the grand narratives and the giant military parades to focus inward on what the war actually cost everyday communities. In fact, a recent newsletter from the Shire of Sandstone noted a gathering of around 45 people who came together simply to pay their respects to all service personnel who sacrificed their lives for the freedom we enjoy today. These local gatherings are so absolutely crucial because they remind us that beyond the treaties, the riots, and the high-level politics, the core of these traditions is remembering the ultimate individual human sacrifice. Ultimately, understanding all of this history challenges us. It asks us to look past those famous photos of kissing sailors and the shredded paper falling from the sky. It asks us to honor not just the triumph of victory, but the profound human complexities, the unspeakable tragedies, the enduring trauma, and the geopolitical divisions that accompanied it all. So, as we close out this explainer, I want to leave you with this final thought. As we look back, how will we choose to remember the true, complex cost of victory? Thanks so much for joining me to explore the real story today. Catch you next time.